Live to it?
Yep, looks good on my end.
Okay, and then do I press start and make you the host and then that's it?
Yep.
Okay, and then I'll find Daniel. Oh,
You
actually, let me first find him before I make host. So, welcome to all those who are coming in.
Daniel, my brother.
Okay.
Here he is. The elusive Daniel Bogart.
Sorry, I dropped and broke my computer, so I'm having to use my kid's computer.
Oh.
Why did you do that?
I know. I tripped in the garage over junk and
no.
Yeah, and don't recommend doing that again.
No.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Broken computers and good computers and all. We're really excited for another, what I'm sure will be a vibrant discussion. I think I'm a little bit nervous about our discussion today. So I trust we're gonna
That makes me happy.
Does it?
Yeah.
So just a quick recap. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping. We're really grateful to our producer, Autumn, who is listed under producer. So if you do have any technical difficulties, you can message them directly. There is live transcript available somewhere on your screen. There should be a button, or it might be under the three dots where you can turn on live transcript, or you can always press that to turn off the subtitles. These programs are being recorded and they are available afterwards on Facebook and YouTube. All of them can be found via CRC's YouTube. If you are interested in participating with us via the chat, then reach out to us for the Zoom link and we'll love to bring you in if you're watching this over Facebook or YouTube. And if you're watching it later because you missed it, then we're glad you're still tuning in. And this is really just an opportunity for the four of us. My name is Rory Pickernese. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and I'm here with Rabbi Jim Bennett of Congregation Sher Emeth, Rabbi Carney Rose of Congregation B'nai Emunah, and Rabbi Daniel Bogart of Central Reform Congregation. Not all of you always know where we line up, but the four of us have in the past and continue to study with the Hartman Institute and want to use the learning that we've taken and the questions that we've grappled with towards some of the big questions that are facing our Jewish community today. So if you have other suggestions, you can feel free to always put them in the chat or send them to us via email. And we're always interested in, I don't know, whatever seems to be pressing of the day. So with that, I will pass this over to Jim Bennett, who's going to facilitate our discussion today.
Rabbi
Thanks,
Bennett,
Rory. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Could we just say a mazal tov to Autumn, whose Hebrew name is Rivka Rachamim, I just found out, Rivka Rachamim. So I just wanted to welcome our sister, our brother, our she, they, I don't know what the right pronoun is, if I'm sorry if I didn't get it right, but I just want to welcome Rivka Rachamim to our brotherhood and sisterhood, our community. It's just wonderful to have you with us, traveling with us.
Yes.
They, them, I apologize. I'm working on it. My kids are going to educate me on this.
Welcome. Yes, thank you for calling out Mazel Tov to Autumn, and welcome to everybody who's here with us again. It's I think I speak for all of us that as busy as we all are, and we are all incredibly busy in our lives, all those of us who are panelists and all those of you who are attendees in these gatherings, we the panelists love the opportunity to dialogue with one another and with all of you. And before I jump into today's topic, I did want to just kind of do a little promotion just because it's on my mind. Many of you may be familiar with a podcast that Yehuda Kurtzer of the North American and Shalom Hartman Institute sponsors and hosts called Identity Crisis. This week's edition, I guess, this week's podcast, I found particularly compelling when I had a chance to listen to it yesterday. if you are not a subscriber to the podcast, I urge you to go wherever you listen to podcasts and to find Identity Crisis, and to listen in particular to this week where Yehuda Kurtzer hosts Rabbi Daniel Hartman in a really powerful and compelling conversation about an article that Rabbi Hartman published recently in this, which is called Sources, a journal of Jewish ideas, which you can subscribe to yourself. And in this collection of really powerful essays, Rabbi Hartman offered an essay entitled Liberal Zionism and the Troubled Committed, in which he challenges in many of the same ways that I think the four of us have been struggling over recent months with issues of morality and Jewish nationalism and the Jewish state and the Palestinian people. And I found it particularly relevant and timely, not only for what it says about us as American Jews in relationship to the state of Israel and the Zionist project, but also, quite frankly, what it says about us as Americans and as human beings in our own political environment. And I was so moved by it that I just wanted to do a little advertisement and encouragement to everybody to seek it out and listen and read if you can. But that's not our topic for today. In thinking about what we were going to talk about today, Rabbi Rose Carney suggested to the four of us two articles, which I hope those of you who are attending and listening had a chance to receive via the email reminder, and maybe to look at. We'll take a quick look at some selections of those two articles today as well. They're two really fascinating articles. One, which was published by the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, entitled My Militant Sister Campaigns Against Intermarriage. I am engaged to a Gentile. Here's how we remain family. We'll return to that in a moment. The second of these articles, which was published online in a blog in the Times of Israel by somebody named Menachem Baumbach. He writes, "Thou shalt love your child who leaves religion. Just as God accepts us regardless of our weaknesses, so must we ultra-Orthodox accept our children when they choose a different way of life for themselves." And when you sent these articles out to the four of us and said, hey, let's read these and talk about these, my initial reaction was, they're really interesting, but they're really not either one of them about me or most of us. Because one of them is about a person whose sister is in Israel campaigning about trying to keep Jewish Israelis from marrying Arabs in particular, non-Jews in general. And the other is about an ultra-Orthodox or Haredi person who's trying to counsel his fellow observant Jews not to abandon their children, even if their children seem to be abandoning their ultra-Orthodox or Haredi lifestyle. But as soon as I read the articles, I responded the way I responded, which was, yes, this is very much about us. Because one of the most compelling issues, I think, facing the American Jewish community and all of us and all of our communities and the worldwide Jewish community is the great challenge of assimilation, the great challenge of loyalty to or disinterest in the faith, as particularly expressed by the challenges of interfaith marriage and the way we as a Jewish community respond to it. So I kind of distilled this back down to at least an opening conversation for us today that is less about the articles to which we can return, but more about each of us and our individual philosophies and positions and thoughts and ideas and challenges vis-a-vis interfaith marriage and its role, both in our communities, in the congregations or communities that we have or do serve, and or in our own personal philosophy as rabbis and how we approach the question of interfaith marriage and how we should respond to it. And so I thought maybe we could begin by each of us just taking a few moments to kind of try and summarize something which, at least for me, and I suspect for all of you, has been a lifelong and career-long journey. And I'm happy to open up to any one of you if one of you wants to jump in and start, or I can start myself. So if one of you would like to just be the korban to offer yourself as a sacrifice to share your point of view. Carney, I see you've unmuted, which is a good sign.
I'm unmuting to say, Hamatchil b'mitzvah omrim lo gemor. If you start with the mitzvah, you have to finish. I'm going to suggest that you're already on the roll.
All
And
right.
maybe you'll go and then we'll jump in, if that's okay.
Well, I'm happy to do so. So I want to say the following. Interfaith marriage and my relationship with it has been both a very personal and a professional passion of mine since I realized that I wanted to be a rabbi. Even before I was ordained as a rabbi, while I was a rabbinic student, I found myself having extremely strong feelings about my understanding of interfaith marriage and my responsibility to embrace it in the way I have chosen to embrace it as a rabbi. And I realized when I reflect back on now, more than 40 years of this position evolving and deepening, that while I started out early on feeling defensive and having to justify why I was willing to welcome people who chose to marry someone out of the Jewish faith, I very quickly changed my personal relationship and my description of my understanding to saying that I am quite passionate and quite principled in why I have always and always will, as far as I can predict into the future, believe that it is my responsibility as a rabbi to welcome people who choose to marry somebody regardless of their faith, and to assist them and to guide them and to be as present to them as I possibly can. And I do so not, by default, not with making excuses, but I do so out of great principle. And one of the core principle is one of the principles that emerges in the second article that we're going to hopefully look at, which is simply the principle of love, or what we in Judaism like to say is chesed. That one of our greatest obligations is to celebrate chesed and love and to act with chesed and love. And so from the earliest times that I became aware of interfaith marriage, I realized that it was my responsibility. That earliest time was when my own sister approached me when I was a rabbinic student and asked if I would be present at and help to officiate at her first wedding to somebody who was not Jewish. And I had a momentary thought when I paused and said, well, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I should. And very quickly, within seconds, realized, of course I can, and of course I will. And I did, and I have never turned back. I am deeply committed to the idea that if a person who is Jewish approaches me and asks me to officiate at their wedding, that I consider it a great honor to guide them on that journey, to consecrate that commitment that they have chosen to make. And it's not my place to judge who they have chosen to marry or why, other than perhaps to offer them counsel as a member of the clergy, as I would anybody, to explore their relationship and make sure it's a healthy relationship. But that I have always officiated at interfaith weddings, and I have only become more open and more inclusive of those for whom I will officiate. I rarely say no to anyone if I'm able to be present. There are specific reasons when I might, but I really believe passionately that my role as a rabbi, on behalf of the Jewish people, is to honor a person who comes to me and asks me to help them to consecrate and celebrate their decision to marry somebody, to spend their life with someone. I even will officiate for people who are neither is Jewish if they have a good reason for asking me to be the person to consecrate their marriage with them and to officiate. So that's a brief introduction, trying to be as summary as I can. And I'll turn it over to one of you who might want to add your own perspective or your own journey. Nobody's willing to jump in. Can I call on you, Daniel, to maybe share your journey?
happily. To me, the discussion on interfaith marriage and officiation has to begin with the reality that in the non-Orthodox world in the United States, 80% of Jews are marrying non-Jews, or just about that number, which is to say that interfaith relationships, interfaith marriages are the reality, and in fact, the norm within our communities. Despite hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars spent trying to fight against it over these last 50, 60 years, misguided efforts in my mind, for all sorts of reasons that push people away, for reasons that hurt folks, that et cetera. Right, even one of the less spoken about things that people may not realize is that the birthright program has as one of its really stated goals endogamy, getting Jews to marry other Jews. We tend to think of it being about Israel. I've had an interesting journey with officiating and not officiating interfaith marriage. Before I came to CRC, I was serving at a large suburban conservative congregation in Cincinnati, where I wasn't allowed to go to an interfaith wedding, right? Couldn't go and participate, not even just as a rabbi there, just couldn't go as a guest of a wedding. I really had my personal flip. I know I've talked about this in a different setting in Hebron with you, Jim. I have such a memory of being there with the rabbi of Hebron, who gave us a speech about how he has, 76 great grandchildren who every single one of them is observant, and I had this, I should say this was 2 weeks before I started as a conservative rabbi. I had this personal sense of crisis. It became a binary in my mind. If I had to choose, not that we get to choose such things, but if I had to choose, would I prefer my kids end up as Jewish as could be, as settlers in Hebron, or would I prefer that they share my core values and not have any ounce of Jewish identity or self-identification? And it wasn't a question when it became that kind of binary, right? For me, at least, I would much prefer that they share my core values about how we live in the world and how we approach others, and liberalism writ large, and progressive values, than that they have a Jewish identity. And it was this break for me where all of a sudden I realized that I had been trained in and saw myself a part of the Jewish identity industry, what I sort of dismissingly call continuity LLC, which is to say that Jewish institutions had trained me to be in the business of convincing people to stay Jewish, and to pass that Jewish on to the next generation, with very little focus actually on what the nature of that identity was. It was like a box labeled Jewish that we passed to the next generation, saying, carry this because I carried this, with little regard for what was within it at all. And all of a sudden I realized that that was not how I wanted to spend my life. I wasn't interested in serving Jewish identity. I was interested in serving the Jews in front of me. And since that moment, I have happily and really happily, joyfully officiated, co-officiated at all sorts of different weddings. In fact, just this last week, I officiated at a wedding with a nun, which was wonderful. I love working with nuns. They're pretty across the board. I've never worked with a nun that I don't love. And it's really moved for me from serving this idea of identity and continuity to serving the human beings right in front of me instead. The irony of it is, I actually think the Jewish identity industry is self-defeating. I think it leads to a hollow sense of what Judaism is and what Jewish identity is. It doesn't exist much beyond the idea of keep being Jewish for whatever reason. And actually, I think getting out of that business and being in the Torah business, the business of serving the people in front of me, of trying to make the world better, trying to make our lives better, trying to make our communities better, that it actually creates a rich and vibrant Judaism that's much more appealing to people than the sort of vacuous, hollowed out sense of Jewish continuity industry that I had been personally stuck in. So I guess that's a little bit of my story there.
Thanks.
Jim, you were very helpful, I should say, also throughout this journey for me, and our phone calls and our conversations and seeing you co-officiate a wedding. Even though, of course, I grew up at CRC, where this was always a part of it, but it took a journey to get back.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And also at the same time, I want to state the obvious, which is the position that I have articulated is my own personal position that Daniel has articulated. They're not the only positions that are legitimate that exist in the Jewish community. And we have two other participants on this dialogue, who I think equally passionately hold different places on a continuum of how do we as a Jewish community respond. So maybe, Carney, do you want to go next, or Rory, if one of you would like to jump in? Carney, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks. And I want to thank you both for the honesty. I could really feel like the pouring out of what's very deep within you. So I thank you both for sharing that. And I also want to say that having this conversation is a little fraught. It's a little fraught because there will be people maybe on this call or who will watch this streaming at another time, this recording at another time, and attempt to pick apart what it is that we're saying, looking for ways in which to poke holes in the arguments that we're making. And I don't really want to do that. I don't want to be involved in that. I would hope that people would be more generous of spirit with us. And I also really appreciate the notion of the journey that each of you has been on. For me, people who journey are the kind of people I want to hang out with. So I thank you for sharing your journeys. I will say to you that I too have really been in the process of evolving in and around this issue of intermarriage specifically, because I think that's where we really want to go. I'm with you 100% on the notion of trying to be open and to be loving. I want to say, Daniel, that I'm sad about something. I'm sad about the notion, as you describe it, of a box sort of freeze-dried that was handed to you. And talking about continuity LLC and that kind of notion, it makes me very sad because I don't think it is the only alternative. I think there are alternatives that are far more beautiful and rich and exciting and meaningful. I'm not sure that we have given, and I'll take some responsibility here as a rabbi of a community doing this for 26 years in congregation, we've necessarily given our congregants, those people who are in front of us, the people in our shuls and our communities, the necessary tools and insights to see what Jewish tradition has to teach as beautiful and meaningful and worthy of passing down from generation to generation. And I'm part of that industry, and I take my own, I mentioned my own sins in that regard, that sometimes we have been part of the problem. So I want to say that I, for a very long time, was not at all interested in officiating at interfaith marriages, not at all. But what I always was willing to do was to say there are wonderful rabbis like Rabbi Bogart and Rabbi Bennett, et cetera, in every community in which I found myself, who will take very seriously the Kedusha, the sanctity and the holiness of marriage, and will walk you through a process that will be meaningful and consequential for you. And even though I myself am not willing to do so, I want to make sure you have the best possible person. I'm sort of looking at Daniel because this happened not so long ago, that I sent somebody in your direction. By the way, I think just we as rabbis tend to always give more than one option, right? So that people can find different kinds of flavors. And I try to think about who is in front of me, right? That term's been used here already, and who might be the right rabbi for that particular individual. And I do this out of great love, understanding that the Judaism that they're going to talk about with this couple, or the sanctity and the holiness, the Kedusha of their union, will be tinged by their own orientation to these issues. And maybe they have the right lashon, right? Maybe they have the right language, like vernacular to be able to connect. That was sort of the way that I did this. I would say that in the last 5 years, that's really changed for me. And I'll tell you why it's changed. First of all, I've noticed that obviously the numbers of intermarriages are skyrocketing. And the people that I have deep relationships with, people who I really, really love, people that I am connected to in a wide variety of ways. In some cases, I mean, now I'm here 17 years. So these kids were b'nai mitzvah, right, when I first got here. And I've stayed in touch with many of them through their high school years, into their college years, into their early professional lives, and now into their relationships, are turning to me and saying, you helped mediate meeting for me from a very young age when I was first conscious. And now I am going through something very important. I've met somebody that I really love. And I would really like your wisdom in terms of how to navigate this next parak, this next chapter in my life. And so the step that I took in between was to say, I counsel anybody who comes to me on marriage. In fact, I will actually pursue members of my congregational family and say, look, I know you've made a choice. I just want you to know that I'm here and I'd love to meet with you. And so I try to meet with every one of the couples. But I'll say to you that I'm now heading in another direction. And that direction is, I think we are missing an opportunity. And I think I'm part of a very small, maybe vocal, hopefully more vocal over time, group of conservative rabbis, and I'm a conservative rabbi trained at JTS. Maybe that would be important to identify also for people who might not know our affiliations, where we are not permitted to officiate at these unions. But I want to say the following. I want to be part of a group of individuals who can come up with what I'd like to call a halachically defensible position for officiating in certain circumstances at marriages of individuals who are both not of the Jewish faith and tradition in the most obvious way. And I am waiting for that to happen along with a small group of colleagues, and we're starting to have those conversations. And why? Because I am fearful of what Daniel shared so beautifully, that what we are doing is perpetuating the notion of handing over this freeze-dried version of Judaism, a Judaism that does not insert enough of the heart and the spirit, does not insert the fact that we have always been impacted by the sociology and anthropology around us, that we've always been influenced by the tzorchei sha'ah, the needs of this moment in time. And I do believe that coming to a rabbi with the wisdom of Jewish tradition that we have inherited, we have cultivated, that we are continuing to cultivate, will be of tremendous assistance and value in mediating the meaning for people as they enter into this very holy and sanctified union called marriage. And that if we absent ourselves from participating in this, we're running the risk of not only cutting the individuals that we love, these people we have relationships, off from that great treasure called Torah, Judaism, whatever it is you want to call it, right? But we may also be creating a scenario where their children don't inherit it, because not only had they initially inherited something that's a little freeze-dried, which partially I take responsible for, but also now we are turning our backs on them. And they say, this is not one stira, this is not one slap to the face, this is another stirat lechi, it's one more on the other side, right? And here we've patched them twice. We've hit them with two zetzes, which I wonder if people can really recover from. And so they head for the hills. And they're not the hills that we necessarily want to head towards. So I may have said more than maybe my rabbinic union would want me to say about these issues. I don't think I'm alone. I am not currently officiating, and some will say to you're a chicken and you should be more brave and you should move forward. I may yet get there. This conversation may help in that process. But again, I want to go back to my bottom line. It is time for us to create a halachically defensible orientation, as halakha means an awful lot to us, for engagement and involvement. Will that ceremony look exactly the same as Kiddushin as we currently do a Jewish wedding? The answer, of course, is no, right? But the conservative movement has done all kinds of interesting. I remember the first time I officiated at a same-sex union, right? And I was getting slammed from all the corners within the movement as well. Of course, there were a few vocal voices who also were supporting all of that. We've made all kinds of orientations that make it possible for us to have a halachically defensible position. So I'll leave you with that as my orientation to all of this. And I hope you'll pray for my soul. and my livelihood. So.
If I can
Thank
jump
you.
in for a second, Jim.
Yeah, please.
Harney, first, I just want to say thank you for sharing that, for your honesty there and really beautiful words. I also think it's worth pointing out that the reform movement's current sort of standard policy discourages its rabbis from officiating at interfaith marriages. And in fact, I was on the Responsa committee, the Jewish law committee for the reform movement, and really wanted them to take up exactly the question that you're advocating for there, Carney. This question of what would be the halachic category to describe a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. And I was very clearly and very loudly told that that was not a question that we were interested in, or that the movement was interested in taking up in any way at all, that the status quo is exactly where they wanted to stay. And that was my last day on the Responsa committee.
Yeah, that and a quick comment on that, Daniel. And I want to echo your words. Thank you, Carney, for your honesty, for the clearly the thought out and deeply pained journey that you find yourself on, but also your passion for finding a way to a place of integrity for yourself and for your community and for the Jewish people. We'll come back to the question of, is halachic category necessary or not? Because I might take a different position than some of you. But before we go there, I want to allow Rory to jump in and share her obviously very different perspective as well on these issues.
So thanks, Jim, for just throwing us into the deep end here. And let me also echo my deep appreciation to all three of you for sharing what is obviously something that what I like first want to really highlight in all of this is that, this isn't just like a legal question that we're grappling with. I mean, I think there's like deep theology, deep love, deep interpersonal connection that's at the core of what each of you shared. I feel like I know you all a bit better for the way that you've described all of this, and I'm grateful for that. So I also have, I guess, a journey, right? We all have a journey in some ways, but I'm actually going to start my journey a little bit earlier, because when I first read this article that you shared with us, Carney, this first piece, this JTA piece that somebody mentioned is actually also in the Jewish Light this week. I very much related to this author in a lot of ways. I mean, I didn't grow up in a settler village near an Arab village in Israel, but or in the settlements, but like to the extent that I grew up in a very insular Orthodox community. And I grew up also very much with, the way that the author of this piece kind of describes, there was a right way and there was a wrong way. And we knew the right way and other people were just the wrong way. And they weren't necessarily bad people for the wrong way. Some people were bad people for the wrong way, but a lot of people were just ignorant. I mean, it was like a big part of my upbringing, and it wasn't necessarily always explicitly said, but it was like, if you knew what we knew, you would obviously do what we're doing because we have truth on our side. And so you who don't do what I do must just not have truth. And that's a little bit sad for you, but maybe you'll get there, maybe you won't. And I think for me, a big part of my journey, similar to what this author describes, was really getting to know people, and the ways in which getting to know people forces you to engage with people and to realize what sounds a little silly to say, right? The core humanity of other people. There's something really fundamental about engaging with people and realizing, oh, we listen to the same music, or we have similar fears about aging family members, or we have similar struggles with whatever the fill in the blanks are. And so for me, college was a really big part of that, of just becoming really close to a wide range of people and suddenly realizing that my way of life wasn't any more moral or any more holy or any better than anybody else's. For me, that journey also took me, that was a very personal journey that actually had me somewhat struggle with my own Judaism an Orthodox identity, because on some level, right, if everyone has a path to the truth, then why is my path, if my path not any better than anyone else's path, then what's the point of this? And for me, I think a big part of it is my own history, my own, what it is to come from this really deep tradition, to come from this rich history that I do think is my pathway, even as I recognize that other people are going to have their own paths. And so with all of that, I struggle with this question really deeply, because if all of those things, right, if every person has human dignity, if every person is can be a good person, then who's to say that any relationships are better than any other relationships, or why somebody chooses to care about another person is any better? And so on a really personal level, that's, and I think I really related a lot with some of what you were saying, Carney. I think also, right, like I kind of grew up in a world where there was like a distant cousin who was intermarried to someone, but other, and we all, like, he was always welcome and we were all really nice, but like it was really known that he wasn't really Jewish. And everyone kind of, still said it with a little bit of a, not quite derision, right? But there was like some feeling about all of that. Right, I grew up in a world where that wasn't really the case, or people, told stories of people who would get kicked out of the community for that, or families that would sit shiva when that would happen. And so I realized the hurt that was causing. I realized and for me, I think it was more, and maybe this is some of also what I was hearing in you, Carney, like for me, it was the realization that I don't necessarily, like at the time, I remember thinking I didn't want to marry someone Jewish because like I thought it was just important to marry Jewish, but because I realized like this was such a holistic, intensive lifestyle, right? Like what would it be for me to, want to have a kosher kitchen if somebody in my house was not also kosher? And what is it to try to keep Shabbat where I'm not utilizing electricity if somebody else in my household is doing those things, right? And so for me, it wasn't even just about specifically Jewish, but it was specifically about, this lifestyle that I wanted to have that I think, I realized was pretty unlikely that I would find someone willing to share that lifestyle if they didn't also adhere to it in their own way and practice it in their own way. All of that is like a very personal side of it, but coming to intermarried, I think for me, so I have not officiated at any interfaith marriages. I have at times been, I'm not sure, I'm trying to remember if maybe I was asked to do one. But actually, interestingly for me, one of the first marriages that I was asked to officiate were two friends of mine, both of whom were not Jewish. And I kind of thought to myself, like, oh, maybe I can, like legally, I think I could do this. And I actually went through this like internal soul searching of that process and realized, and I instantly said that I couldn't do the wedding for them. And I realized for me, it was that my authority to say that two people were married came from me knowing how to do a Jewish wedding. And so I didn't feel like I could do a Jewish wedding for two people who were not Jewish. I mean, so in this, I think like this is maybe where I'm sort of, I don't know that I'm totally with Carney in terms of like, I'm not like pushing at the edge to say we need this halachic discourse. I mean, I think there's a worthwhile conversation. I don't know where I stand on it personally, but I think, right, like I do think the category becomes somewhat important, because I think for me, like the big question is could I do a wedding, right? Like from an actual, not just like does my denomination allow me to, right? But like, is there a halachic category? Because if there isn't this halachic category, then I don't actually have any capacity, right? Like, who am I to tell two people that they're married? I don't, right? The only authority I have is to say, I know that you've done this Jewish process, but if you don't want this Jewish process, then I can't really do anything for you. And so so I'm like, I felt, I resonated a lot with a lot of what Carney was sharing. And I'm very, very, I do believe strongly in what we need to be doing, I think, to embrace people in the community. I think the statistics that Daniel cited were really important. And at the same time, I think what we also realize is that part of this fear that we had 50 years ago was that we thought that we, in our own kind of lacking of self-confidence, we thought that as soon as Jews were allowed to marry out, like we'd all leave. I remember actually Yehuda Kurtz were talking about this at one point. Like it never occurred to us that other people would want in, right? Like we as Jews were like, you get the first train out. Like, and what's amazing in these statistics are how many of these non-Jewish partners are integral parts of our community. And they are the people who might be sitting on our boards. They might be driving their kids to B'nai Mitzvah lessons. They might be participating in Torah study, right? Like they're sometimes more active than the ones who are born Jewish. And so I think I agree wholeheartedly. I think we need to have a space in our community. I think that rejecting people does not actually bring people closer. I think that people choose their lifestyles for a variety of reasons. And I think part of what sometimes makes me sad in some of these decisions are that we often find that it's people who just don't care. Because people who care, right, those are the ones who end up with these really engaged partners, right? People who are committed to being part of the Jewish community, they're staying in the Jewish community regardless of and they're bringing more people along with them. And then they've got these in-laws who are suddenly super active, right? You know, like you've got this whole family coming in. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I grapple with sort of like what that space is within the Jewish community and what my capacity as a Jewish leader is to then sort of create this Jewish ceremony when not everybody in the ceremony are themselves Jewish.
Thank you so much. Beautifully spoken and heartfelt. I want to focus us a little bit and narrow the conversation a little, because something has come up repeatedly that I think is of great interest to us, at least of great interest to me, and I feel like it's of interest to all of us. There is our own personal opinions and feelings and passions, and there is also our responsibility to the structures of Jewish communal life. We could call it our obligation to halakha, which for some of us is of paramount importance. People who choose to be observant in different ways feel a passion and a need to be. It looks like we just lost Daniel for a moment.
Yeah, I'm going to assume he's going to find his way back.
I hope it was nothing I said.
You start talking about halakha and the guy
Exactly.
drops off. There you go.
So, but there's also the question, and I want to
elect him to something real fast.
Yeah, right. There he comes. Welcome back, Daniel. Welcome back. We're glad to have you. So I was just saying that I think there's the issue of halakha, but for some of us at least, especially those of us in the Reform movement for whom abiding by the dictates of halakha, of Jewish law, is of less concern than addressing the individual autonomy and the freedom of each person. There's a different concern, and I want to just address it for a moment because I hear it.
Jim, sorry to ask you, please, just for a moment, because I think we've given a very narrow definition of what halakha means, and I want to make sure, at least to share before we start the conversation about the halakha, tell you what I mean by halakha.
Please. Go ahead.
I'm talking about halakha as halicha, right? The walking, the way in which our ancestors have walked this path that we call Yiddishkeit, that we call Judaism, right? I don't mean it in the narrow definition of law. It has as much to do with folkways and minhagim, right? Customs, and the ways in which we've inherited from our parents and our grandparents, of the way in which we go about living our lives to try to walk alongside, at least for me, the way I'll categorize it, the Almighty. And so I want to make sure to say, when I talk halakha, and maybe differently than others on this Zoom, and maybe differently than you want to address it, Rabbi Bennett, and that's okay too. I just want to say, when I say halakha and I used it, I mean it in the halicha, in the way in which we live out and walk this pathway called Jewish tradition, which of course has evolved in every generation. So I want to make sure to expand it beyond simply the words Jewish law, if at all possible, for this conversation.
No, I'm so glad you said that. And that's completely consistent with what I was hoping we could focus on, which is those movements who really value and define how that looks and describe a certain choice of ritual practice or lifestyle choices or guidelines for how to sanctify life in a certain way. Calling that halakha, halicha, the path. I love that, by the way. I love that terminology. But that's very different than where I wanted to go, which is determining that a certain kind of marriage or marriage ceremony qualifies as what we call in Hebrew kiddushin, marriage as consecrated by or described by Jewish law. And what I would say, and this may be sounding a little revolutionary to some or all of you, I actually believe that all marriage, regardless of the religious faith commitment of the participants in that marriage, all marriage has the potentiality of being kiddushin. And one does not have to be Jewish to enter into a relationship that is kiddushin in Hebrew is a holy marriage. And I know that that could be very revolutionary, but one of the reasons I've chosen to officiate at interfaith weddings is because of a desire to affirm that any marriage has the potential to be kiddushin. It doesn't have to have Jewish language or ritual or participants in it. If we believe, and it's funny, I connect this very much to the teachings that Rabbi Hartman focuses on in his Zionist-based arguments in the article I referenced. If we believe that all human beings are born with a fundamental right to dignity and respect and love from all of us, then marriage ought to be a category in which that is the possibility as well. And that I, as a rabbi seeking to officiate a kiddushin, and Daniel, one of the reasons I reject the idea of trying to define kiddushin and non-kiddushin in order to find a loophole so that rabbis can officiate for weddings, just not call it kiddushin. I think all genuinely loving relationships can be qualified as and categorized as and described as kiddushin. And therefore, I'm happy to use the Jewish wedding ritual as a way to affirm that, regardless of whether somebody is Jewish or not. I'll just say, by the way, one last comment, just a practical thing. I long ago in my career stopped using the traditional vows, Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, for couples when neither or one of the couple do not live a life according to the law of Moshe and Israel. And instead I substituted for different words that are more true. And that often happens in marriages between two people who are both Jewish, who after we talk about the vows, they say, well, that's not what we want to say to each other. We don't live Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. We are committing ourselves Be'avat Olam, for example, in some cases, with everlasting love to one another. And still for me, and I know this is just me, I don't get to define kiddushin for all Jews or all rabbis or all human beings, but for me, all of those can be called kiddushin. They can all be called Jewish marriage. But, you know,
I'm with you. You got me. Just here's my modification. First of all, thank you. That's beautiful, and I really appreciate the integrity with which you're speaking. Really, I mean, you can almost feel it through the screen, which is fantastic. You know, you're really coming across with such genuine integrity, which doesn't surprise me because that's who you are. But I want to say the following, right? I do believe, like you, that every union between two people who really come together with the right consciousness, okay? Because I think we've all been in this business long enough to know that sometimes we might even recommend to people that maybe marriage isn't the right thing for people. But every union of that sort is kadosh, but that means holy, but that doesn't mean it's kiddushin. And I think that's where maybe we're a little different. In other words, there is something that the tradition has sanctified or has categorized as kiddushin. But that doesn't deny the kedusha of two people who love one another, who want to be married, tachat kanfei hashchina, right underneath the wings of the Almighty, who want to be married in ways that are respectful of the traditions of both individuals. Very often, they want the notion of God, right? They want this notion that there's a sanctification. So that's my distinction, and why I think, and maybe again, a reflection a little bit of the denomination to which I find myself currently still being allowed to be part of, that I can say that there's a difference between Kedusha, holiness, which I see in many unions of people of all faiths and all backgrounds, and something we're going to exclusively call Kiddushin for the terminology alone. And again, when I marry folks of the same gender, right, I don't use the same language that I use in a Kiddushin, because do I believe there's sanctity there? Absolutely. But I don't use the same language because it's not germane. right? The language of, "Kesamechecha yitzircha began Eden mikedem," the whole notion of a male and a female being in Gan Eden, like that doesn't make any sense to say that to people and in fact, it's insulting to them. And I would say one of the things that really disturbs me about my own denomination, right, is that we very often will hide it in the Hebrew and then kind of make up something, fudge it up in English, because we think that the people in front of us don't really understand it. You know what the real problem is? When I don't have integrity about what it is that I'm saying, I feel like a fraud and a sham. And I don't want to feel that way. So what I want to say is, I very much respect where you're coming from. I just want to suggest that we can hold both these. We can hold the notion that Kiddushin is something that is a halachically defined reality by our tradition for many, many years, right? For many generations. And we can also create other kinds of Kedusha and ceremonies that honor Kedusha, even if it's not Kiddushin. And that's for me. Now, maybe it doesn't work for you, but that really works for me. And I'm trying to find the language, and I've been working with couples. I spend a lot of time with couples, as I'm sure you all do. We do 6 sessions prior to marriage. That's at least 6 hours of time. So if we're doing 20 or 30 weddings a year, that's an awful lot of our year that's committed to that. It's even long before we even do the weddings. Trying to get at this notion that this life can be sanctified, that this union can be sanctified, that the byproduct of this union can be sanctified, that their families, parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, everybody can be elevated in that process. And so I want to make the distinction between Kiddushin and Kiddusha for me. And maybe that's a point of contention or a point of disagreement.
Yeah, no, respectful, different use of the terminologies, but beautiful and beautifully said. Daniel or Rory, you want to jump in?
So I want to jump in, and I might take us a little bit afield. So Jim, like, you could feel free to then yank it back. But part of what I'm really struggling with in this conversation is like the emotions that I'm feeling, where on the one hand, I feel this incredible gratitude for the diversity that we have here and the diversity that I know exists within the Jewish community. And similarly, I think Carney referenced earlier, like, I've had couples who have come to me about a variety of different things where I've been able to say, I'm not the person who can do that for you, but let me connect you to the person who can. And I want to say, usually, excuse me, what I want to be clear in that is that in saying that, right, that might sound like it's a cop-out answer, but I think in saying that, what we're saying is that we support your effort to do this, right? But I can't, right? Because to work with me is to do something a certain way, right? Like, I only do weddings a certain way. And so I'm going to have like certain language on the ketubah, or I'm going to do, right, like all of these things. And so even if I have a couple, who, it's not even just an intermarriage question, they can both be Jewish or whatever, but then they realize they don't want an Orthodox wedding, but I'm Orthodox and I do Orthodox weddings. And so, it's saying, I think absolutely this conservative wedding is a totally valid wedding, and I can refer you to my wonderful colleagues who are going to do a beautiful thing in 6 sessions with you, and very intensive, and with a really beautiful product. So I'm really grateful for all of those things, and I'm grateful for the diversity that exists within our community. And I'm also a little scared by it. I'm a little scared, not so much. Maybe there's a part of me that worries about what we potentially lose, right? Like, there's like in my own story where I was saying, right, like, I feel this deep connection to what is it to be part of these thousands of years of tradition. I'm not going to pretend like tradition didn't change over those thousands of years. Of course it did, but it's changing way more rapidly now than it ever has before. And so there is a part of me that worries a bit about that. But I would say even more than that, I worry about these questions of, like, at what point do we stop being 4 different opinions within the same structure? Like, when does the diversity start to branch us out, right? Like, and I think we're not really so far already in terms of, at what point, so someone could come to me and I can say, I can't do that for you, but, go to Jim. Jim's a friend of mine and he'll take care of you. And I know he'll do something wonderful for you, right? At what point in the reverse, when, Jim, you call me and you say, I have this congregant and now they want to do this Orthodox ceremony, can you help them out, right? When do we suddenly start having these difficult questions to say, well, are they Jewish according to the same standards, right? Or do we count the marriage, right? Like, it's one thing to somebody to say, I'm not asking your opinion, right? I can go to the wedding and I can say that's a beautiful wedding, right? But when something suddenly happens and now, like, like this question, right? On some level, like, there's a an intellectual question, a debate that just happened about whether or not this is kiddushin, and it's like a fascinating sort of halachic argument, but it has no practical difference as long as that couple doesn't ask me my opinion, right? For as long as like that couple says we're really happy with our ceremony, like I would never go to that person and say, you know, that wasn't really kiddushin, it was kadosh but not kiddushin, right? Like we would never say that, right? Like that might be that's like a fun, but like what starts to scare me is like on the one hand, I think there's such a richness to this tradition. And I also start to get scared because I say, when do we all start to veer really far away from each other?
Rory, can I challenge you? And maybe Rabbi Bennett, this will be reminiscent of a conversation we had several years back. I don't know if you're thinking about the same situation I'm thinking about, okay? But what happens, Rory, when somebody comes to us who has, you know, the whole notion of a little bit of information is a dangerous thing, right? Like they want something different than the rabbi who has tremendous integrity wants to deliver, right? Or is able to deliver with their own integrity. And they want something, by the way, it often is not consequential. It's often trappings, right? Like kippah, talit, 2 blessings. We're not talking like essential elements, right? 2 rings, 1 ring, like little things that on some level feel like very, very, very minor, but for them become their halacha. And they get stuck there and they're not as nimble as we are able to be with one another, nor respectful as we're able to be with one another, or understanding or pluralistic or whatever terminology you want to use. And they get stuck in that. And no matter how hard we try to explain this notion, they simply want something different than we can deliver. And then they become frustrated with us because Rose can deliver it and Bennett can't, or Bennett can deliver it and Rose can't. And that somehow or another becomes the kedusha, forget kiddushin, the kedusha of the moment is these, I would call them banal elements that don't really mean anything in the grand scheme of anybody's consciousness other than for the people who are getting married. I don't mean to disparage those individuals, but I think there's an element there that we have to deal with because, and Rory, the one thing is, you're not a congregational rabbi, right? So the answer you always can say is, you know, it's not for me to do it, right? Like there's an element of that. For us, what's at stake when I say no to a congregant is really, I think, can be really consequential. I don't mean to challenge you.
No, it's potentially about relationship, right?
Oh, it's for sure. But I don't think that's exactly what I'm saying, though.
No, I'm not thinking you're saying. I'm asking the question for myself because it's my question because I'm dealing with it more regularly than I care to.
Right. No, I mean, look, I think that these are all really hard questions. And I want to also, like, for anyone who's kind of, you know, I don't think people always realize like what goes into all of this for everyone, because I want to also just make sure that everyone knows, like, not only, yes, like you who have congregations, this is, you know, your membership, this is, and also, right, there's the person who's going to leave because you're not letting them do this quirky thing that they want to do, but then there's the person who's going to leave if you do let them do this quirky thing. And there's also sometimes this fear, and I don't know if you all have this in the same way, but I know it absolutely happens in the Orthodox community, that like to do one wedding differently, or if it's not, will somehow potentially put all your other weddings into question, right? Like if somebody knows you did this, is someone going to then say that these other marriages are no longer valid?
And there's that issue. And what I also heard you saying, Rory, and yes, Carney, by the way, I was thinking of the same situation, but I think Rory's saying something even other than that as well, which for me, what I was thinking about, Rory, was not only that question of calling into question your status and your authority as a rabbi, but also the status of the people for whom we officiate and the children that are produced in these marriages. I know full well, and I try and be completely open and clear with people. If you study with me for conversion, here is the result. You will be viewed as Jewish in this dimension of the Jewish community, but probably not in this part of the Jewish community. Similarly, my officiating at your wedding, whether your partner is Jewish or not, is going to be considered fully a Jewish marriage in my eyes and in the eyes of certain people in the Jewish community, but there will be many others in the Jewish community who will not accept the authoritative nature of that marriage ceremony unless it is with a kosher ketubah, unless it is halachically officiated at with edim, witnesses that are in accordance with Jewish law, and therefore you may need an officiant who honors the traditional definition of what is Jewish marriage, kiddushin. And I need to be fully open and clear about that, even while I'm somewhat militant with people. When they ask me, I say, look, I don't really care whether my conversion is accepted by the Rabbanut or not. I don't really care whether the wedding ceremonies that I officiate align up with their definition of kiddushin, Jewish marriage. I care that we have discussed this and have integrity in our approach, but I think you're calling appropriate attention to the fact that there are severe and permanent consequences. You know, the question of we could get off on lots of tangents. The question of divorce, Jewish divorce, and getting, and whether somebody needs to be granted a get, because certain people in the Jewish community will view that as an obligatory requirement. Otherwise, they're going to create illegitimate children in future relations. I mean, these are all real issues, and that's what I heard you saying, Rory, is that these are potentially divisive for the Jewish community. Daniel, I know you've been wanting to jump in there, so I want to turn to you.
I'm really resonating with what you said, Rory, and it's leading me to think about conversions, because every once in a while there will be a conversion candidate that I work with. I love working with conversion candidates. One of my very favorite things that I do. I think it's probably true for almost every rabbi I know. And I'll think to myself, wow, I bet it would mean a lot to this person to have Rory on their Beit Din. And then I go through the whole process in my head of why that won't work. And I'm really thinking a lot about what you said, Rory, about it works until that person asks me, do I consider them Jewish? Do I consider them married? Right? And the things that we choose not to say out loud, or the questions that we choose not to ask, or there's a lot of that. My answer to your question tends to be that being in Jewish community in some ways is the more significant piece than halachic status, or at least it is to me. At CRC, and this was radical when I came, really took me a while to adjust to it. And now I love it. We make no distinctions based on Jewish status, none at all. You can be a member, you can be a part of any ritual moment, you can whatever based on your status, or not based on your status. And first of all, I love the implications it's had to the conversion process, because it means that the only reason someone converts is because they really want to convert. There's no sort of bait hanging out there, sort of blitzing them on towards this. But yeah, right, there's real questions of what this will mean for the Jewish future, for are we turning into separate tribes, right? Not just Israeli Jewry and American Jewry, which I think is its own question, if we're turning into separate tribes that we should maybe take up at some point, but also even within our own American community.
Beautifully said. It resonates a lot with me, Daniel, because I also hold the same principles, and Sharemeth has the same policy that if you are a member of the community and want to participate, there's no boundary based upon your status of Jewishness or not. Anybody can do anything here. And yet I have great respect for, and I just want to reaffirm this, that I have great respect for my colleagues in the Reform community elsewhere, and also in the more traditional branches or streams of Jewish communal life, who choose to guide their decisions and boundary decisions based on different principles. I cannot be consistent if I don't offer them the same respect for your positions, Rory and Carney, and other traditional elements in the Jewish community that I ask you to offer to me and Daniel and others who hold our positions. That's one of the beautiful things about this dialogue that I think is so powerful to me, and I think to all of us, and hopefully to those who are listening to us go on and on and on. So
could I ask a question just vis-a-vis?
Please.
What role does a ritual of transformation play for each of you in terms of the process of joining the Jewish people, not joining CRC or joining Sharemeth, right? but is there a requirement in your own mind of some kind of ritual that has, I don't define what the ritual is. I don't mean Brit Milah or mikveh necessarily, right? Is there something that has to happen for there to be a transformation of status for it to feel for you as the rabbi? Or do you sort of flip it to the person and say, yeah, you want this, or you're expressing your yearning for this. What are we going to do? What role does ritual play, if any, in that process for you?
Daniel, do you want to answer first, or do you want me to jump in there?
Happy to jump in. It's funny, when I'm thinking of conversion, the metaphor that comes to mind is marriage. And when we were talking marriage, the metaphor became conversion. But there's all sorts of ways of being in relationship and being family to people that have nothing to do with the biology of family, right? And to me, the conversion ritual is that moment of marriage when you're no longer sort of a beloved, welcome member of the household, and instead you become family. And those rituals are really important to me and really transformative. I love that moment of taking someone to the mikveh. And I should say personally, I always strongly encourage. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever been a part of a Beit Din that did not follow the ritual requirements of conservative Judaism, specifically because I want to make sure that the folks who I am helping them enter this family are having the widest birth into the Jewish community that they can have, which, as I understand it, would be into a significant chunk of the conservative movement, as long as the sort of core conversion rituals are followed, as well as the American Jewish community.
So I'll thank you for sharing that. I'll be a little bit more of the renegade here and say, Carney, in answer to your question, the latter and not the former. In other words, I believe deeply in the power of ritual. But as a Reformed Jew and as a Reformed rabbi, I believe that there is really no limit to the potential meaningful ritual which one can use. And sometimes ritual is physical. Sometimes ritual is not physical. Sometimes it's public and sometimes it's private. So the way I approach both conversion and marriage is quite similar, actually. I do my best as a rabbi because it's the language I speak. It's the language in which I'm educated and choose to live my life, to educate the individual or the couple on the rituals that we have inherited from our tradition. I want them to know what, for example, traditional conversion involves. Hatafat dam brit, or circumcision for a man, and immersion for a woman and man. And I want them to know about those and to explore them, to study them, to discuss them. But I do not require them, either of them. If I'm officiating a conversion very soon where the individual, after great study and debate, decided he does not want to engage in hatafat dam brit. He doesn't want a symbolic drop of blood to symbolize his circumcision. And I believe he has the right. I don't hold any Jew accountable for any ritual. I don't require somebody in my congregation or in the Jewish community to observe any of the ritual practices of Judaism. I hope that people will choose to observe many, if not most of them, but that's a personal choice. And I hold that same standard for conversion and also for marriage. I meet with every couple, as we all do, and I ask couples to study the Jewish ceremony and to look at the inheritance of all the rituals. But if a couple were to say to me, Rabbi, we don't want to stand under a chuppah, or we don't want to have sheva brachot, or we don't want to, break a glass, which isn't even halachic, or whatever it might be. We don't want a ketubah, or we want this ketubah and not that, or we want to add this ritual, which actually does not come to us from Jewish tradition. I've had all sorts, as we probably all have, had beautiful rituals added to wedding ceremonies that have nothing to do with Jewish tradition, but add beauty and meaning to the individuals getting married. Not long ago, I had a couple that wanted to jump the broom at their wedding as part of their Jewish marriage as a Jewish couple under the chuppah. And who am I to say, no, you can't do that? I suppose there might be boundaries for me. I haven't found one yet that I'm uncomfortable with, because if they come from a place of integrity and a place of mutual commitment, and that word I started with, which I think we're going to probably come back to in a minute as we prepare to wrap up, if they come from a place of chesed, of love, then that's ritual for me. But Carney, please.
I just want to press it because I'm intrigued, because both Rabbi Bogart and Rabbi Bennett said that a person can join each of their congregations. There's no standard for joining, right? But so is there a ritual of becoming a ger toshav, right? Like a resident alien, or a member of Central Reform, or a member of Sher Emeth, right? Is there some way in which there is some covenantal ritual expression that would take the place of that formal giur, right? Even though, Rabbi Boger, maybe it sounds like you would like it to be that, but if a person says, I'm a member of this kihila, I'm a member of this community, is there something, and by the way, I will say to you this, in our case, we're looking to create new rituals, because even though we still, right, continue to require hatafat ambrit or milah and mikveh, right, as a requirement, we're looking to now think, how do we do something that is more, I think, existential for the individual? And very often I kind of flip it back to the person and say, what would make you feel like you are legitimately a member of this kehillah, right? And by the way, again, maybe outing myself, we do allow people who are not halachically, as we define it, Jewish, to be members of the congregation, right? And that's a relatively new development. We're not giving them shlishi on Yom Kippur, okay? But they have the ability to participate in the life of the congregation if they so choose. And more people would like some kind of indication of that sort, formalized. Maybe it's in front of the Aron HaKodesh. Maybe it's holding a Sefer Torah. Maybe it is in their home doing something. But is there anything that you do to bring people to that place of being part of the bigger family, or part of the people, but maybe not the same tribe? Maybe just to use that language that you were going with, Daniel?
At CRC, I think I've mentioned this before, but it's really one of the distinctive things about the community, I think, is that before anyone can join, we have these brunches that they come to, that we lay out our core values. We make it clear that we are a feminist organization, that we are an organization that believes in reproductive justice, that believes that we should protect trans kids, that believes that Black Lives Matter, that believes that Jewish wisdom and Jewish values can change our lives and change the world. And I'd never thought of it as a ritual before you laid it out like this, Carney, but I think it really is a covenant, right? And we're really clear during that brunch, or that Zoom session these days, I guess, no bagels anymore, that, this is who we are and these are our core values. And you don't have to agree with all of them, but you should understand this is who we are and that's not changing. I had never thought of it as a ritual before, but you're really sort of transforming that in my mind. I appreciate that.
That's beautiful. Carney, I also want to say, as we, I think, prepare to kind of wind things down and wrap up, because I know other people have obligations coming up soon, that I think you've challenged us, not only challenged B'nai Emunah, but challenged the Jewish community to find ways to affirm and ritualize people's decisions to join. And what I heard, Daniel, I think is probably a little bit more explicit than what we do at Shai Emeth, which is to really an affirmation, a positive affirmation of wanting to belong, of choosing to belong is sufficient. And Carney, to answer your specific question, I personally resist the temptation to create categories of those who are ger toshav, those who are outsiders but inside, and those who are truly inside. I think the idea of the stranger in our midst is a biblical model and that has been preserved by centuries of Jewish tradition, but one which, as I understand it, the most progressive branches of Judaism today, or the Reform movement at least, and I think to some degree other movements, have resisted more and more and say, look, if people want to be part of us, we are not going to categorize them as other, but rather we're going to say, yeah, welcome. And, Rabbi Rick Jacobs of the Reform movement, the president of the URJ, has described the need for us to widen the tent, to broaden the tent, not to narrow it and define it. So I have a little bit of resistance at the idea that our job.
My question, Jim, comes from a different place. My place comes from people who say to me, I want something. Rabbi, as a creative liturgist or as a creative ritualist, can you help us find something that will demarcate the moment of transition for us? And I'm just wondering what it is. And I hear some things that are being done. And the question is, we can learn from one another about all of this. And as we evolve it, I'd be happy to share it again. But I'd be fascinated. Maybe some of you know in other places what they're doing, specifically for people who are looking for a non-halachic, just because we use that terminology, orientation of warmth and acceptance and loving and saying you are here, something more than just writing your check for dues. Right, there's got to be more than that, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful. Maybe we should, Rory, I'm going to turn it to you. Maybe we should each kind of make a final statement here as we prepare to wrap up. We haven't even gotten to the articles, although I think I urge everybody to read them. They're kind of the catalyst for this fascinating conversation. But Rory, why don't you take it away, and then each of us can kind of have a closing statement.
Yeah, just one of the things that I'm also like sitting with in all of this is like, for as much as we can engage in this different debate and, who gets shlishi on Yom Kippur, as you said, Carney, right? And like, what are the different places in the various ritual and all of that? The other piece of it, though, that I think is important to acknowledge, and I think I actually got this from, not everything comes from Hartman, but most things come from Hartman. And I think it was with sessions with Christine Hayes of like the recognition that there are people in our community, there are people who do not themselves identify as Jewish. I'm not talking about like debating about, conversion, right? But there's people who do not identify as Jewish, but who have cast their lot with the Jewish people, and like, what does that also mean for us? And I think in the most depressing of ways of that's the, when they come for us, they get swept up along with us also. But, in the most optimistic, right, it's like what happens to the Jewish people happens to them. And whether it's because they are raising a Jewish family, even as they don't identify as Jewish, whether because they are, immersed, like they themselves are just like living in this Jewish community. And it's interesting, to sort of Carney's question, I don't know if there's necessarily a ritual or what we call that, and I don't know if we need to, but I think that it's really important. And I think that this is a very modern phenomenon that we never could have imagined before. That's just important to name that. I'm just remembering vividly, Jim, you organized a retreat a few years back for us with some rabbis and imams and evangelical pastors. And the person who was introducing it, he was saying the key distinction is that, imams and pastors want to convert you, but Jews don't want to convert you. And some of the people, they were fascinated. I remember sitting down to lunch, and I think I was sitting next to some of the pastors, and they said, you don't want to convert us? And I just said, nope. And they said, why not? And I said, don't want you. And they said, why not? And I was like, you don't need this. It's a hassle. Like, and I really, and I love it. I love it with all my heart. And yet there's also like this deep feeling, but there's people who have that hassle, right? Like they're hassling alongside with us, and whatever good comes they get, but whatever bad comes, they don't jump ship. And that's something that's completely new. It might be very American. I'm not totally sure how that exists in other parts of the world. But I think that's like a key part of this conversation. And I have like this deep appreciation and curiosity and love that emerges from just knowing that given our whole history with all the ups and downs that frankly have had more downs than ups, that there are people who want to cast their lot with the Jewish people. And that itself is an act of bravery, of rebellion, and I think of real chesed.
Thank you. Daniel? Oh, Carney, either one of you.
Really appreciate that, Rory. I guess the only thing I would add is I actually think that's a really old thing too, right? I think there's lots of other times in Jewish history we can go back and find that exact phenomenon, right? Go back 2,000 years to the Roman era, and I think we see it all over. I guess what I'm really struck by today with an Orthodox rabbi, Maharat, a conservative rabbi, a couple different brands of reform here, is how different of a conversation this is than happens in many other Jewish communal spaces. It's why I so appreciate all of you. I appreciate Hartman. I appreciate this. But how often have there been 4 rabbis on a panel who have stood up with the goal of demonizing interfaith marriage? and decrying this phenomenon. And right, that in our very different ways, the four of us have expressed very different positions and belief structures and so on. And yet there is this built-in respect for the decisions that human beings make that I feel so grateful to have this space, to have the three of you. So I will end with that.
Beautiful. We've talked a lot about Hartman and the influences of others on our decision-making processes and our thinking. I just want to throw into the conversation the name of one of my most significant teachers, and that is Rabbi Erwin Kula of Klal, who long ago was talking about the disruptive innovations, Clayton Christensen, et cetera, but the disruptive innovation within the Jewish community vis-a-vis these issues. Does the name Egon Mayer mean anything to you? From long ago, a sociologist, long before, I don't think Egon is long gone, but I remember sitting with Erwin, and he brought Mayer to come speak with us about these issues and was kind of futurizing what was going to be. And the future is upon us in so many ways, based on a conversation that's more than 20 years old. So I just want to say that one of the things that I learned from Erwin is we have a Torah to teach, and the Torah is to be taught to as many people as we can reach in whatever way, shape, or form we can do it. And that the wisdom, the essential wisdom of Torah, which is a divine gift, is one that we have the ability to share. And each of us is trying to do that in our own unique versions and ways, with integrity, with honesty, with love. I'm so glad that, Jim, you started the whole conversation with chesed, because olam chesed yibaneh, right? The world will be built with chesed, only through chesed. And so I hope that we'll continue to be gomlei chasadim, to continue not only to bestow this chesed upon one another in these interactions, which make even difficult conversations and topics palatable, because we know that we're not here to hurt one another. We're here to grow from the interaction with one another. We're here to be bettered and to be forged into new versions of ourselves. So I want to thank you for that, but I also just want to really make mention of the fact that Erwin has been beating this drum for a lot of years. And it's influenced the whole variety of folks, myself included, and many of our thoughts and our ideas, even though we haven't necessarily given attribution for that. So if people want to read more about that or hear more about that, there are lots of podcasts that Erwin's been involved with as well.
Thank you. Beautiful, all of you. And I want to return to, it's kind of fascinating to me, and I'm really grateful for how easy it is for us to digress and go on a journey. We began talking about interfaith marriage. We drifted into conversion, but thank you, Carney, for bringing it back to, if you look at both of the articles, they both end with the power of chesed, of love, and the necessity of love, and the importance of not forgetting that ultimately it's all about love. I think that it's self-evident that the mutual respect I have for all of you, and that I feel that we have for one another, and that we get from the people who are listed on the Zoom screen as attendees, those of you who are listening and watching and sharing your questions, which are very powerful. And I'm sad that we can't get to them in the time we have, but all of us together can actually fulfill this vision of Olam Chesed Yibaneh. It's not that the world was only founded on love, with love, but it's also our obligation to act with love and kindness and chesed, as Rabbi Rose said. And that, regardless of which stream of Judaism we identify with, regardless of how halachically observant we choose to be or how we define halacha, ultimately acting and living and caring and being filled with chesed is the way to truth and the way to where we're going. So thank you for being on this journey together. It's really beautiful, and I feel blessed, as I think we all do. We'll be back again next month. And we welcome your ideas for topics for us to tackle, and we love to talk about anything. So please,
or the same thing,
or the same thing again, because we'll forget by next month. So thank you all, and blessings to everybody.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you for the facilitation. Really well done,
My
Yeshua.
privilege.
Thank you.
My privilege.
And thank you all. Maharat Rory, you still with us there? Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to say that I want to tell you how much I respect and appreciate you in this conversation. I did mention that there's a lot at stake for us as congregational rabbis. What I couldn't finish saying, and I think, and maybe we're still being recorded, I hope you're okay with this, but there is a tremendous amount for you in all of these conversations. And I know that often you get slammed from the right and to the left, right? The people on the far right who don't consider you to be a rabbi, those foolish people on the far crazy right. And then on the other side, I even called you, you're not a congregational rabbi. I didn't mean by that I don't respect it. I'm just saying that there's questions, what's at stake, for each of us. And in your work, you are very often out on a limb. And I want to make sure to share that with you. And I often marvel at how you dance in all the worlds in which you dance with grace and dignity. Because in the end, I answer to this population of people, right? The people who engage me, who pay my salary, who evaluate me, right? You seem to have to answer to every Tom, Dick, Harry, Uncle, Yona out there. And I never see you losing your composure, and I never see you losing your chen. So I just, I hope you get as much positive feedback as you get some of the challenges from the other side, because I'm watching chats and conversations, and I've lived here long enough to see that people tend to want to take you of all of us to the woodshed, which is really unfair. So you never should abandon us.
Thank
You are the string on these crazy kites. So without you, this whole thing dissipates. So
Thank you. That's very, very sweet of you to say. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Hello to everybody. And thank you, Autumn, for being there behind the scenes, as always.
Yeah.
We'll be back next month.
See you then.